The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the polished marble floor of the Riverfront Ballroom as I watched my husband Derek passionately kiss another woman in front of our 70 wedding guests. But this wasn't just any woman. This was Chloe Brennan, the domestic violence counselor, who had been helping us work through what Derek called my trust issues and emotional instability for the past 8 months. The woman who had convinced me that my concerns about Derek's controlling behavior were signs of my own insecurity. The woman who had made me question my own reality while she systematically dismantled my support system from the inside. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As our anniversary guests stood frozen in shock, Derek pulled away from Chloe and looked directly at me with a smile I had never seen before. Cold. Triumphant. "Sorry, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "but I can't pretend anymore. Chloe has shown me what real love looks like, and I'm done living a lie with someone who refuses to get the help she needs." The room erupted in whispers and gasps, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heart breaking. 7 years of marriage, 5 years of couples therapy, and now this public humiliation orchestrated by the very person who was supposed to be helping us heal. But as I stood there in my anniversary dress, surrounded by the wreckage of my life, I noticed something that would change everything. In the corner of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a decorative pillar, stood a man I hadn't seen in 3 years. Marcus Chen, Derek's estranged older brother, was recording everything on his phone, and the expression on his face wasn't surprise. It was pure, calculated fury. The aftermath of Derek's announcement felt like moving through thick fog. Guests began leaving in uncomfortable clusters, offering me pitying glances and half-hearted condolences that felt more like sympathy for a terminal diagnosis than support for someone whose husband had just publicly discarded them. My best friend Zoe Martinez rushed to my side, her usually perfect makeup now streaked with tears of outrage. "Natalie, we need to get you out of here," she whispered urgently, wrapping her shawl around my shoulders as if it could somehow shield me from the humiliation. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the scene unfolding before me. Derek had his arm around Chloe's waist as she accepted congratulations from some of our guests, as if this was a celebration rather than the destruction of my marriage. Chloe, with her perfectly styled auburn hair and her professional demeanor that I had trusted for months, was now glowing with the satisfaction of a woman who had won a prize she had been coveting. The irony wasn't lost on me that a domestic violence counselor was publicly participating in what could only be described as emotional terrorism. "Natalie." The voice behind me was deep and familiar, though I hadn't heard it in years. I turned to see Marcus Chen approaching, his tall frame cutting through the dispersing crowd with purpose. At 35 he was 2 years older than Derek, but the resemblance was minimal. Where Derek was charming and conventionally handsome, Marcus had an intensity that made people uncomfortable. His dark hair was longer than Derek's perfectly groomed style, and his clothes suggested someone who valued function over fashion. He had been cut off from the family 3 years ago after what Derek called unforgivable betrayals and destructive behavior, though he had never told me the specifics. "Marcus," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't know you were here." "Derek didn't invite me," he said, his eyes never leaving his brother across the room, "but I've been watching him for months. Watching both of them." He turned his attention to me, and I saw something in his expression that surprised me. Not pity, but recognition. "We need to talk, Natalie. There are things you don't know about your husband and his therapist friend, things that go way beyond simple infidelity." Zoe looked between us suspiciously. "Natalie, maybe we should just go home. You don't need to deal with family drama right now." But something in Marcus's tone made me pause. "What kind of things?" Marcus glanced around the ballroom, then leaned closer. "The kind of things that could put Chloe Brennan behind bars and cost Derek everything he thinks he's gained tonight. But not here. Meet me tomorrow at Pioneer Courthouse Square, noon." And Natalie, he handed me a business card that read, "Chen Digital Security Solutions. Don't go home tonight. Stay with Zoe or check into a hotel. Trust me on this." Before I could ask what he meant, Marcus melted back into the crowd, leaving me holding his card and feeling more confused than ever. Zoe took one look at my face and made the decision for both of us. "We're going to my place," she said firmly. "You can figure out the rest tomorrow." As we gathered my purse and wrap, I caught sight of Derek and Chloe near the ballroom's exit. They were speaking in low tones with an older woman I recognized as Dr. Helen Reeves, Chloe's supervisor from Pacific Northwest Family Services. Dr. Reeves looked deeply uncomfortable, glancing repeatedly in my direction before hurrying away from the couple. Something about that interaction nagged at me, but I was too emotionally drained to process it fully. The drive to Zoe's apartment in the Hawthorne district passed in a blur of streetlights and concerned questions I couldn't answer. Zoe had been my friend since college, and she had never liked Derek, though she had kept her opinions mostly to herself after we married. As we pulled into her driveway, she finally voiced what I knew she had been thinking all evening. "Natalie, I know this is awful, but maybe this is actually a blessing in disguise. Derek has been controlling you for years, making you doubt yourself, isolating you from friends, and now we find out he's been working with that counselor to gaslight you professionally. This might be your chance to finally see him for who he really is." I wanted to argue with her, to defend the man I had loved for 7 years, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew she was right. The past year had been filled with increasingly subtle manipulations that I had dismissed as stress from work or normal relationship challenges. Derek had convinced me to stop seeing my individual therapist because it was creating conflict with our couple's work. He had suggested I limit contact with certain friends who were negative influences on our marriage. He had even convinced me to close my successful social media marketing consultancy and work as a freelancer from home, claiming it would reduce my stress levels and help me focus on our relationship. Sitting in Zoe's living room that night, wrapped in her softest blanket with a cup of tea I couldn't taste, I began to see patterns I had been willfully blind to. The way Derek had positioned himself as the reasonable partner seeking help while painting me as the unstable one who needed fixing. The way Chloe had consistently validated his concerns about my behavior while subtly undermining my confidence in my own perceptions. The way every breakthrough in therapy seemed to involve me taking responsibility for problems I wasn't sure I had created. "Zoe," I said finally, my voice hoarse from crying, "what if this has been planned all along? What if the whole therapy thing was just a way to break me down so Derek could justify leaving?" Zoe set down her own cup and leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. 8 months ago, Derek suddenly became concerned about our marriage and insisted we needed professional help. He specifically requested Chloe Brennan, said he had researched her extensively and she came highly recommended. But what if he had already met her? What if this whole thing was orchestrated?" As I spoke the words aloud, they felt both impossible and inevitable. And tonight, when he announced their relationship, did you see how prepared they both looked? This wasn't a spontaneous declaration of love. This was a calculated public humiliation designed to make me look like the unstable wife who drove her husband into another woman's arms. Zoe nodded slowly. "That would explain why Chloe always seemed to side with Derek in your session. You mentioned that several times, how she would validate his concerns about your behavior while minimizing yours about his. I thought about the hours I had spent in Chloe's office, pouring out my fears and insecurities, only to have them used as evidence of my psychological instability. The way she had convinced me that my discomfort with Derek's increasing control was actually a sign of my own trust issues stemming from childhood abandonment. The way she had reframed every legitimate concern I raised as a symptom of my need for individual therapy to address my underlying issue. She had access to everything, I whispered, the full scope of the betrayal hitting me, every vulnerability I shared, every fear, every insecurity. She used my own honesty against me to help Derek build a case for why our marriage was failing. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped, thinking it might be Derek. Instead, it was from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Marcus. I know tonight was devastating, but what I have to show you tomorrow will give you everything you need to make this right. Derek and Chloe made a mistake tonight. They revealed their hand too early. Sleep well." I showed the message to Zoe, who frowned. "Are you sure you can trust him?" Derek cut him off for a reason. Maybe, I said, thinking about the fury I had seen in Marcus's eye. But right now he's the only person who seems to think I can fight back instead of just accepting this as my fate. That night, lying on Zoe's guest bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Derek's triumphant smile and Chloe's satisfied expression. I thought about all the friends I had distanced myself from at Derek's suggestion, all the professional opportunities I had declined to focus on our marriage, all the ways I had made myself smaller to accommodate his vision of who I should be. The woman I had been before I met Derek felt like a stranger now, someone confident and independent who wouldn't have tolerated a fraction of the manipulation I had endured. But as dawn broke over Portland, filtering through Zoe's bedroom curtains, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Anger, not the self-directed anger that Derek and Chloe had convinced me was appropriate, but clean, focused rage at what had been done to me. For the first time in years, I wasn't questioning my own perceptions or wondering if I was overreacting. I was certain that I had been systematically manipulated and betrayed by two people who had used their professional relationship to destroy my sense of reality. I got up and looked at myself in Zoe's bathroom mirror. My face was puffy from crying, my hair disheveled from a sleepless night, but my eyes looked different, clearer, more determined. Whatever Marcus had to show me, whatever evidence he claimed to have, I was ready to hear it. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted justice. And more than that, I wanted to make sure that Chloe Brennan could never use her position as a counselor to manipulate another vulnerable person the way she had manipulated me. I thought about Dr. Helen Reeves's uncomfortable expression at the party, the way she had hurried away from Derek and Chloe after their announcement. If Chloe had violated professional ethics by becoming romantically involved with her client's husband, there would be consequences beyond just personal ones. Her license, her career, her ability to harm other women in vulnerable positions, all of that could be at stake. For the first time since the champagne glass had shattered at my feet, I smiled. The morning passed slowly as I waited for my noon meeting with Marcus. Zoe had left for work but insisted I stay at her apartment, bringing me coffee and pastries from our favorite bakery before reluctantly heading to her office. I spent the time researching Chloe Brennan online, looking for any information that might help me understand how this elaborate deception had been constructed. What I found was disturbing in its implication. Chloe's professional website emphasized her specialization in helping women overcome destructive relationship patterns and self-sabotaging behavior. Her client testimonials, which I now read with new eyes, painted a picture of a counselor who was skilled at identifying women's supposed psychological deficiencies while helping their partners understand and cope with these problems. The language was subtle but consistent. The women were always the primary source of relationship dysfunction, and Chloe was there to help their partners navigate these challenges. I also discovered that Chloe had been divorced twice, both times citing her ex-husband's emotional unavailability and commitment issues. Her social media presence was carefully curated to project an image of professional success and personal fulfillment, but there were gaps in her timeline that suggested periods of professional or personal difficulty. Most telling was a blog post from 2 years ago, titled "When Therapists Cross Boundaries, Understanding and Preventing Professional Misconduct," which read like a manual for how to engage in exactly the kind of behavior she had exhibited with Derek and me. At 11:30, I gathered my things and headed for Pioneer Courthouse Square, the public plaza in downtown Portland that locals called the city's living room. The weather was typical for late spring in Oregon, overcast with a light drizzle that made everything smell like cedar and rain. I found Marcus waiting near the courthouse steps, dressed in dark jeans and a leather jacket that suggested he took his personal security as seriously as his professional work. "Thank you for coming," he said as I approached. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admit, "but I need to understand what happened last night, and I need to know why you've been watching Derek and Chloe." Marcus looked around the square, then gestured toward a coffee shop across the street. "Let's get somewhere private. What I have to show you is going to change everything you think you know about your marriage." As we walked toward the coffee shop, I studied Marcus's profile, trying to understand why Derek had cut him out of their family so completely. Whatever their conflict had been, Marcus clearly harbored deep resentment toward his younger brother, but was that enough reason to trust him with the wreckage of my life? Before we go any further, I said, stopping in the middle of the crosswalk, I need to know why you and Derek aren't speaking. I need to know if this is about helping me or hurting him. Marcus met my eyes, and I saw a complexity there that reminded me why I had always been slightly intimidated by him during the early years of my marriage. Both, he said simply. Derek destroyed someone I cared about using the same methods he used on you, and when I tried to warn her, he convinced our entire family that I was the problem, that I was jealous and destructive and couldn't be trusted. He paused, then added quietly, her name was Anna, and she was the strongest person I knew until Derek convinced her she was weak. Something cold settled in my stomach. What happened to her? She took her own life rather than continue living with the person Derek had convinced her she was, Marcus said, his voice steady but his hands clenched into fists. And Derek moved on to his next victim without missing a beat. As we reached the coffee shop, I realized that my 7-year marriage might have been built on a foundation far darker than simple deception. And if Marcus was right, then Chloe Brennan wasn't just an unethical counselor who had fallen for her client's husband. She was a professional predator who had found the perfect hunting partner. The coffee shop Marcus chose was tucked into a narrow alley between 2 office buildings, the kind of place that survived on the loyalty of regulars rather than foot traffic. Inside, exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture created an atmosphere of deliberate invisibility. Marcus ordered for both of us while I found a corner table far from the few other patrons, my hands still trembling slightly from the revelations about Anne. When Marcus returned with our drinks, he placed a sleek tablet on the table between us. Before I show you what I've been collecting, I need you to understand something. What Derek did to you, what he's done to others, it's not impulsive, it's methodical. He finds strong, successful women and systematically breaks them down until they question their own reality. Then he discards them when they're too damaged to fight back. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, trying to process the implication that I was part of a pattern rather than a unique victim. How many others have there been? That I know of? 4, including you and Anna. But I suspect there were more before I started paying attention. Marcus activated the tablet and turned it toward me. This is Anna Kowalski. She was an environmental lawyer, specialized in corporate accountability cases. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Brilliant, fearless, the kind of person who made powerful people nervous. The screen showed a professional headshot of a woman in her early 30s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that sparkled with confidence. She looked nothing like me, but there was something familiar in her expression that I couldn't place until Marcus scrolled to another photo. This one showed Anna at what appeared to be a family gathering standing next to Derek. The confidence was gone, replaced by a guarded wariness that made her seem smaller, despite being the same height. They dated for 2 years, Marcus continued. Derek convinced her that her work stress was destroying their relationship, that she needed to find better work-life balance. By the end, she had left her law firm to take a part-time position with a nonprofit that paid a fraction of her previous salary. She stopped returning calls from friends who Derek claimed were negative influences. She even gave up hiking, which had been her passion since childhood, because Derek said it made him feel excluded when she went without him. The parallels to my own experience were unmistakable, but I had convinced myself that Derek's concerns about my work and social life were legitimate expressions of love and commitment. How did you find out what was happening? Anna called me one night, completely panicked. She said Derek had been recording their conversations and threatening to use them to have her committed if she tried to leave him. She had found the recordings on his computer along with what she called research files about psychological manipulation techniques. Marcus swiped to a new screen showing a police report. She went to the police, but Derek had already laid the groundwork. He had documentation from a therapist stating that Anna was suffering from paranoid delusions and workplace-related stress disorders. The police treated her report as a mental health crisis rather than a domestic abuse case. I stared at the report, noting the date was just over 3 years ago. That's when you and Derek stopped speaking. I tried to help her build a case against him, tried to get her the support she needed to leave safely, but Derek convinced our parents that I was manipulating Anna because I was jealous of their relationship. He painted me as the unstable brother who couldn't accept his happiness. Marcus's jaw tightened. Our family chose Derek's version of events. Anna was completely isolated, and Derek's gaslighting became so severe that she started believing she really was mentally unstable. The coffee in my stomach turned to acid as I understood the full scope of what Derek was capable of. The therapist who documented Anna's supposed delusions. Who was it? Marcus met my eyes grimly. Dr. Chloe Brennan. She was working as an independent consultant then, before she joined Pacific Northwest Family Services. Anna saw her for individual therapy while Derek attended sessions focused on supporting a partner with mental health challenges. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Chloe and Derek had been working together for years, refining their methods on vulnerable women who trusted professional credentials and therapeutic authority. They've done this before. The whole couples therapy setup, the systematic breakdown of the woman's confidence, the public humiliation when they're ready to move on to the next victim. Exactly. And they've gotten better at it each time. With you, they added the element of using couples therapy rather than individual sessions, making it seem like Derek was the committed partner trying to save his marriage rather than the predator orchestrating its destruction. Marcus swiped to a new screen showing financial records. They've also gotten more sophisticated about the financial manipulation. The documents showed bank transfers, investment account changes, and property transfers that painted a picture of systematic economic abuse. Derek had been slowly shifting our shared assets into accounts that were harder for me to access, using my own stress about our relationship as justification for simplifying our finances and reducing my responsibilities during our difficult period. He's been planning this for months, I whispered, seeing the pattern of small changes that I had attributed to Derek's attempts to support me through what he claimed was my emotional instability. The business closure, the social isolation, the financial controls, even the therapy itself, it was all designed to leave me completely dependent on him, and then discard me when I was too broken to fight back. Marcus nodded, but Derek made a mistake this time. He fell for his own partner in the scheme. Chloe was supposed to help him destroy you and then disappear, but instead she convinced him to make their relationship public. That gives us leverage we didn't have with Anna's case. I thought about Helen Reeves's uncomfortable expression at the anniversary party, the way she had quickly distanced herself from Derek and Chloe after their announcement. Chloe's supervisor was at the party. She looked disturbed by what she witnessed. Reeves has been questioning some of Chloe's recent cases, according to my sources inside Pacific Northwest Family Services. There have been complaints about Chloe's tendency to blame female clients for relationship problems while validating male partners' concerns about their wives' mental health. The anniversary party announcement gave Dr. Reeves concrete evidence of professional misconduct. Marcus showed me another screen displaying Chloe's professional history, including her licensing information and previous employment record. Chloe has been careful to avoid obvious ethical violations in the past, but her relationship with Derek represents a clear breach of professional boundaries. If we can prove the relationship existed during your therapy sessions, she loses her license. And if we can prove it was part of a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable women, she faces criminal charges. The weight of possibilities settled over me. For the first time since the champagne glass had shattered at my feet, I felt something other than devastation. I felt What do you need from me? Access to your therapy records, documentation of the financial manipulation, and most importantly, your testimony about how the therapeutic process was used to undermine your mental health and economic independence. Marcus leaned forward. But Natalie, I need you to understand what we're up against. Derek and Chloe will claim that you're the unstable ex-wife seeking revenge. They'll use everything you shared in therapy against you, twist your vulnerability into evidence of mental illness. I thought about the hours I had spent in Chloe's office, believing I was working toward healing while actually providing ammunition for my own destruction. They already have been. That's how they've been able to control the narrative so effectively. Which is why we need to be strategic. We can't just accuse them of misconduct. We need to build an airtight case that exposes their methods and protects any future victims. Marcus showed me a final screen displaying what appeared to be a comprehensive investigation plan. I've been documenting Derek's patterns for 3 years, but I couldn't act without a current victim willing to come forward. You're the key to stopping them. The responsibility felt enormous, but also clarifying. Anna's death hadn't been suicide in any traditional sense. It had been the predictable outcome of systematic psychological torture designed to convince a strong woman that she was irreparably broken, and I had nearly followed the same path, accepting Derek's version of reality and my own inadequacy. "What's the plan?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Marcus smiled for the first time since I had known him, and I caught a glimpse of the person Derek had worked so hard to discredit. "We're going to use their own methods against them. Documentation, witness statements, professional credibility, and most importantly, we're going to let them hang themselves with their own arrogance." Over the next hour, Marcus outlined a strategy that was both elegant and devastating. We would gather evidence of Chloe's professional misconduct, while simultaneously exposing Derek's pattern of financial and emotional abuse. The key was timing and presentation, ensuring that when we revealed the truth, it would be impossible for them to dismiss or deflect. "First, we need to document your current mental and emotional state," Marcus explained. "I want you to see Dr. Patricia Hartwell, a forensic psychologist who specializes in abuse cases. She'll conduct a comprehensive evaluation that establishes your credibility and documents the psychological impact of what Derek and Chloe did to you." I nodded, understanding the importance of professional validation in countering the narrative they had constructed about my instability. "Second, we need to secure your financial records and document the pattern of economic manipulation. I can help you access accounts that Derek has been hiding from you, and we'll need to establish a timeline showing how your financial independence was systematically undermined." The thought of discovering how thoroughly Derek had betrayed me financially was daunting, but I knew it was necessary. "Third, we're going to approach Dr. Reeves with evidence of Chloe's misconduct and offer to provide detailed testimony about how the therapeutic relationship was abused. This gives her the ammunition she needs to file formal charges against Chloe and potentially initiate a broader investigation into her past cases." I thought about the other women who might have suffered as I had, trusting a professional who was actually working to destroy them. "What about Derek? What consequences does he face?" "That depends on what we find in the financial investigation and whether we can prove criminal fraud or theft. But even if he avoids criminal charges, the public exposure of his methods will make it much harder for him to find new victims." Marcus paused. "And there's something else. Derek has been funding his lifestyle partially through a consulting business that advises companies on employee psychological profile. If we can prove he's been using abusive techniques in his professional work, he faces civil liability that could destroy him financially." The scope of Derek's predatory behavior was expanding beyond what I had imagined, encompassing not just intimate relationships, but professional ones as well. "How long will this take?" "If we move quickly and efficiently, 2 weeks to gather the initial evidence, another week to coordinate with Dr. Reeves and the licensing board, and then we present everything simultaneously to maximize impact." Marcus closed the tablet. "But Natalie, once we start this process, there's no going back. Derek and Chloe will attack you with everything they have. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Anna, about the confidence I had seen in her first photograph and the broken wariness in the second. I thought about the woman I had been before I met Derek, the successful business owner who had trusted her own judgment and valued her independence. That woman felt like a stranger now, but maybe she didn't have to be lost forever. "I'm prepared," I said, and for the first time in months, I believed my own words. Marcus and I spent the rest of the afternoon developing our strategy, identifying the evidence we needed, and the timeline for gathering it. As we worked, I began to understand that this wasn't just about seeking justice for what had been done to me. It was about reclaiming my own agency and ensuring that Derek and Chloe couldn't continue their predatory partnership. By the time we left the coffee shop, I had a clear plan for the next phase of my life. It wasn't the future I had imagined when I woke up yesterday morning, but it was one where I had control over my own narrative, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The drive back to Zoe's apartment gave me time to process the enormity of what I was undertaking. My phone had been buzzing with messages all day, friends and family members who had heard about the anniversary party disaster and wanted to offer support or satisfy their curiosity. I had been ignoring them, but now I realized that my response to these messages would be the first test of my new resolve. Instead of the apologetic, self-deprecating responses I would have crafted yesterday, I wrote simple, direct replies, acknowledging what had happened without accepting blame for Derek's choices. Derek has chosen to end our marriage. I'm taking time to process this change, and will be in touch when I'm ready. It felt revolutionary to state facts without adding explanations or justifications for my own feelings. Zoe was waiting when I arrived, having left work early out of concern for my mental state. She took one look at my face and smiled. "You look different, more like yourself. I met with Marcus. You were right about Derek being controlling, but it was worse than either of us realized." I sat down on her couch and began explaining what I had learned about Derek's patterns, about Anna, about Chloe's professional misconduct. Zoe listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as I detailed the scope of the manipulation I had endured. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I should have pushed harder," she said finally. "I could see that Derek was changing you, making you doubt yourself, but I thought it was just normal relationship compromise. I didn't recognize it as abuse." "Neither did I admit. That's what made it so effective. It was so gradual, so professionally packaged, that I convinced myself it was healing rather than harm." Zoe reached for my hand. "What do you need from me?" "Honest. If I start doubting myself again, if I start making excuses for Derek, or minimizing what happened, I need you to remind me of what I know to be true." I squeezed her fingers. "And I need you to help me remember who I was before I met him." "Deal. But Natalie, I need you to promise me something too. When this is over, when Derek and Chloe face the consequences of what they've done, you'll focus on rebuilding your life, rather than just exposing theirs." It was a fair request, and one that reminded me that my ultimate goal wasn't revenge, but recovery. I promised. That evening, I began the process of documenting my experiences with Derek and Chloe, creating a detailed timeline of how the therapeutic relationship had been used to manipulate and control me. The exercise was painful but clarifying, showing me patterns I had been unable to recognize while living through them. I wrote about the way Chloe had consistently validated Derek's concerns while dismissing mine, how she had reframed my legitimate complaints about his controlling behavior as evidence of my own psychological issues. I documented the financial pressures that had intensified during our therapy, the social isolation that had been justified as necessary for our healing process, and the way my own vulnerabilities had been weaponized against me. As I wrote, I began to understand that what I had experienced wasn't a failed marriage or ineffective therapy. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign, designed to convince me that I was fundamentally flawed while Derek was the long-suffering partner trying to help me. The realization was both devastating and liberating, confirming the worst of my fears while also providing a framework for understanding my experience that didn't center on my own inadequacy. By the time I went to bed that night, I had 15 pages of documentation and a clearer sense of my own strength than I had felt in years. Tomorrow I would begin the process of gathering evidence and building the case that would expose Derek and Chloe's predatory partnership. But tonight, for the first time in months, I slept without questioning my own perceptions or wondering what I had done wrong. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Dr. Helen Reeves called me directly, having gotten my number from the emergency contact information in my therapy file. Her voice was carefully professional, but I could hear underlying tension as she asked if I would be willing to meet with her to discuss my recent experiences with Chloe Brennan. "I'm conducting a review of Brennan's recent cases, and your situation has raised some concerns about professional boundaries and ethical standards," Dr. Reeves explained. "I want to ensure that any misconduct is properly addressed, and that you receive the support you need during this difficult time." The timing felt providential, giving me an opportunity to present my case to Chloe's supervisor before Derek and Chloe could control the narrative. I scheduled the meeting for that afternoon, then called Marcus to update him on this development. "This is better than we hoped, Marcus. If Dr. Reeves is already investigating Chloe's conduct, it means other people have noticed problems. You won't be the only voice raising concerns." I spent the morning preparing for the meeting with Dr. Reeves, organizing my documentation and thinking through how to present my experiences in a way that emphasized the professional misconduct, rather than just personal betrayal. Marcus had advised me to focus on the therapeutic techniques that had been used to undermine my confidence, and the ways that Chloe had violated the ethical standards of her profession. As I prepared to leave for the meeting, I caught sight of myself in Zoe's bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had discovered her husband's betrayal just 2 days ago. There was a clarity in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose that came from understanding rather than confusion. I wasn't the same person who had walked into Chloe Brennan's office 8 months ago, trusting in professional expertise and hoping for healing. But maybe that was exactly what I needed to become. Dr. Helen Reeves's office occupied the top floor of Pacific Northwest Family Services, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Portland's downtown skyline. Despite the impressive setting, the woman who greeted me was surprisingly approachable, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her handshake firm without being intimidating. She appeared to be in her late 50s, with the kind of weathered competence that suggested decades of dealing with difficult situations. "Miss Vance, thank you for coming in on such short notice," she said, gesturing to a comfortable seating area away from her imposing desk. "I want you to know that anything we discuss today will be kept in strict confidence, unless you specifically authorize me to share information with licensing authorities or law enforcement." I settled into the offered chair, grateful for the informal atmosphere she was creating. "Before we begin, Dr. Reeves, I need to understand what prompted your investigation into Chloe's conduct. Was it just the anniversary party incident, or have there been other concerns?" Dr. Reeves paused, clearly weighing how much information to share. "Over the past 6 months, I've received 3 separate complaints about Ms. Brennan's therapeutic approach from female clients who felt that their concerns were being dismissed while their male partners were being validated inappropriately. None of the complaints were formal ethics violations, but the pattern was troubling enough to warrant closer supervision. The revelation that other women had experienced similar treatment was both validating and heartbreaking." "What kind of complaint?" "Clients reported feeling blamed for relationship problems that they didn't believe they had caused, having their emotional responses pathologized while their partner's concerning behaviors were normalized, and being pressured to accept relationship dynamics that made them uncomfortable." Reeves opened a file folder. "When I reviewed Ms. Brennan's case notes from these sessions, I found consistent patterns that raised questions about her therapeutic approach and potential bias against female clients. I thought about my own sessions with Chloe, remembering how skillfully she had reframed my legitimate concerns about Derek's controlling behavior as evidence of my own insecurity and trust issues. Did any of these other clients mention feeling like their therapist was taking sides? Multiple clients used that exact phrase. They felt like Ms. Brennan was advocating for their partners rather than maintaining therapeutic neutrality." Dr. Reeves leaned forward. "Ms. Vance, what I witnessed at your anniversary party went far beyond questionable therapeutic techniques. Ms. Brennan's public relationship announcement with your husband represents a serious breach of professional boundaries that could result in license revocation. The weight of professional authority behind my own perceptions was enormously relieving. For months, I had questioned my own judgment about what was happening in therapy. Having an expert confirm that Chloe's behavior was inappropriate rather than therapeutic validated everything I had been feeling but had been convinced to dismiss. I have documentation of how the therapy sessions were used to undermine my confidence and isolate me from support systems," I said, pulling out the timeline I had prepared. "But I also have reason to believe that Chloe's relationship with my husband began before our therapy started, and that the entire therapeutic process was designed to facilitate the destruction of my marriage." Dr. Reeves's expression grew grave as I outlined what Marcus had discovered about Derek's previous relationships and Chloe's involvement in Anna Kowalski's case. When I finished explaining the pattern of targeting successful women and systematically breaking down their confidence, Reeves was silent for a long moment. If what you're describing is accurate, we're not just dealing with a boundary violation or poor therapeutic judgment. This would represent a coordinated pattern of professional misconduct that could constitute criminal fraud. She made notes as she spoke. I'm going to need detailed documentation of everything you've described, and I'll need to contact the state licensing board immediately. I handed her copies of the financial records Marcus had helped me compile, showing how Derek had systematically gained control of our assets, while positioning himself as the responsible partner managing my supposed instability. Derek has a consulting business that advises companies on employee psychological profiles. If he's been using the same manipulative techniques in his professional work, there could be additional victims. Dr. Reeves examined the financial documents with the practiced eye of someone who had seen economic abuse cases before. The timing of these asset transfers correlates directly with your therapy session. It appears that information you shared about your vulnerabilities and concerns was being used to facilitate financial manipulation outside of the therapeutic relationship. The clinical language made the betrayal feel both more real and more manageable. Instead of being the victim of a failed marriage and ineffective therapy, I was the victim of a coordinated fraud perpetrated by two professionals who had violated their positions of trust. Dr. Reeves, I need to ask you something direct. Are you willing to support formal charges against Chloe, even if it means admitting that your organization employed someone who was systematically abusing clients? The question hung between us, and I watched Dr. Reeves weigh her response carefully. Finally, she met my eyes with a determination that reminded me why she had risen to a leadership position in her field. Ms. Vance, Pacific Northwest Family Services, has spent 30 years building a reputation for ethical, effective treatment of individuals and families in crisis. If one of our employees has been using our credibility to facilitate abuse, then exposing and stopping that abuse is more important than protecting our institutional reputation. She closed the file folder decisively. I will personally ensure that Brennan faces the full consequences of her actions, and I will provide whatever support you need to pursue any additional legal remedies. The meeting with Dr. Reeves lasted 2 hours, during which we developed a comprehensive plan for documenting Chloe's misconduct and coordinating with the appropriate authorities. By the time I left her office, formal complaints had been filed with the state licensing board, and Reeves had committed to conducting a full review of all of Chloe's cases over the past 3 years. As I walked through downtown Portland toward my car, I felt a sense of momentum that I hadn't experienced since the anniversary party. The institutional support of Pacific Northwest Family Services would give credibility to my accusations and provide resources for investigating Derek and Chloe's activities that I couldn't access on my own. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. How did the meeting go? I have news about Derek's consulting business that you need to hear. Instead of texting back, I called him directly. Dr. Reeves is taking this seriously. She's filing formal complaints and conducting a comprehensive investigation. What did you find about Derek's work? Can you meet me at my office? What I discovered requires more privacy than a phone conversation. Marcus's voice carried an edge of excitement that suggested significant development. Marcus's office was located in a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, the kind of industrial space that Portland's tech community had embraced for its combination of character and functionality. The open floor plan was dominated by multiple computer monitors and sophisticated security equipment that reflected both his expertise and his paranoia about privacy. Derek's consulting business is more extensive than I initially realized, Marcus said, leading me to a conference table covered with printouts and documents. He's been contracted by 6 major corporations over the past 2 years to develop psychological profiles for employees in sensitive positions. But the techniques he's been using are designed to identify and exploit vulnerabilities rather than assess qualification. The documents showed a pattern of Derek targeting female executives and high-potential employees for what he called stress management consulting, that bore uncomfortable similarities to the therapeutic manipulation I had experienced. Companies had paid him substantial fees to identify employees who might be destabilized by workplace pressures or who showed concerning emotional volatility. Look at this, Marcus said, pointing to a particular Derek identified a female vice president at a tech startup as psychologically unsuitable for leadership responsibilities, based on her tendency toward emotional decision-making and difficulty accepting constructive feedback. 6 months later, she was demoted and eventually forced out of the company. I read through Derek's assessment, recognizing the same language patterns he had used to describe my supposed psychological deficiency. The woman's emotional volatility seemed to consist of advocating for workplace equity policies and questioning budget decisions that favored male-dominated departments. How many women has he targeted through his consulting work? At least 12 that I can document, probably more. And here's the interesting part. Marcus pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop. 3 of the women Derek identified as psychologically problematic were subsequently approached by Chloe Brennan for individual therapy to help them manage workplace stress and relationship challenges. The scope of their partnership was expanding beyond what I had imagined. They weren't just targeting women in intimate relationships, they were systematically identifying successful professional women and using both corporate consulting and therapeutic intervention to undermine their careers and personal lives. We're looking at a coordinated scheme that spans multiple professional contexts, I said, beginning to understand the full implications. Derek uses his corporate access to identify targets, then Chloe provides the therapeutic framework for breaking them down psychologically. Exactly. And the financial benefits are substantial. Derek's consulting fees, combined with Chloe's therapy income from the women he targets, generates significant revenue from their victims' destruction. Marcus showed me financial records he had obtained through his security contact. They've made over $300,000 in the past 2 years from this partnership. The revelation that my personal destruction had been literally profitable for them added a new dimension of violation to everything I had endured. I hadn't just been manipulated and betrayed, I had been monetized. Marcus, we need to contact the women Derek targeted through his consulting work. If they're still being manipulated by Chloe or if they've been damaged professionally because of Derek's assessments, they deserve to know what really happened to them. I've already started reaching out, very carefully. 2 of them have agreed to speak with us, and 1 has documentation that could support federal fraud charges if we can prove Derek's assessments were deliberately designed to harm rather than evaluate. The possibility of federal involvement raised the stakes considerably, but also provided more resources for pursuing justice. What's our timeline for bringing everything together? Marcus consulted his notes. Reeves needs another week to complete her investigation and coordinate with the licensing board. The women Derek targeted through his consulting work are still processing what happened to them, but they should be ready to provide statements within the next few days. And I'm still working on accessing Derek's computer files, which could provide direct evidence of the coordination between him and Chloe. I thought about the complexity of what we were uncovering and the number of women whose lives had been damaged by Derek and Chloe's systematic predation. This is bigger than just getting justice for what they did to me. We're potentially exposing a criminal enterprise that's been operating for years, which is why we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. Derek and Chloe have proven they're willing to destroy anyone who threatens their operation. Marcus's expression grew serious. Natalie, once we move forward with formal accusations, they're going to come after you with everything they have. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and attack? I considered the question, thinking about the woman I had been before I met Derek and the woman I was becoming through this process of fighting back. Marcus, for the past 8 months, I've been living in a reality where I questioned my own perceptions and accepted responsibility for problems I didn't create. I've been isolated from friends, convinced to give up professional opportunities, and manipulated into believing I was fundamentally flawed. I met his eyes. Being attacked by them can't be worse than being controlled by them. Over the next several hours, Marcus and I developed a comprehensive strategy for coordinating the various aspects of our investigation. We would work with Dr. Reeves to ensure the licensing board had complete documentation of Chloe's misconduct. We would support the women Derek had targeted through his consulting work in pursuing their own complaints against him, and we would coordinate with law enforcement if the evidence supported criminal charges. The plan was ambitious and complex, but it felt manageable because it was based on documented evidence rather than personal accusations. Every element of our case was supported by professional records, financial documents, or witness testimony that could be independently verified. As the day progressed, I began receiving calls and texts from mutual friends who had heard about the anniversary party incident and wanted to offer support or satisfy their curiosity. The conversations were illuminating, revealing how effectively Derek had controlled the narrative about our marriage, even among people who considered themselves my friends. "I always thought Derek was so patient with your moods," one friend confided. "He would mention how hard he was working to support you through your difficult times, but he was always so understanding about your struggles." The comment revealed how skillfully Derek had positioned himself as the long-suffering partner while painting me as the source of our marital problem. Even friends who cared about me had been influenced by his carefully crafted image of himself as supportive and me as unstable. Another friend was more direct. "Honestly, Natalie, I'm relieved for you. Derek always seemed controlling to me, but whenever I mentioned it, he would say he was just trying to help you manage your anxiety." I started wondering if I was misreading the situation. These conversations showed me how Derek's manipulation had extended far beyond our marriage, influencing how our entire social circle perceived our relationship and my mental health. The public nature of his betrayal at the anniversary party had actually done me a favor by forcing people to reevaluate their assumptions about our marriage and his character. That evening, Zoe and I met Marcus for dinner at a quiet restaurant in the Hawthorne district to review our progress and plan the next phase of our investigation. As we talked, I realized that the woman sitting at that table was fundamentally different from the one who had discovered her husband's betrayal just 3 days earlier. "You know what's strange?" I said as we finished our meal. "I feel more like myself now than I have in years. Even with everything that's happened, even with the uncertainty about what comes next, I feel more grounded and confident than I did when I was married." Zoe smiled. "That's because you're not constantly second-guessing yourself anymore. You're not trying to accommodate someone else's version of who you should be." Marcus nodded. "Derek's manipulation was effective because it was subtle and persistent. He convinced you that your own perceptions were unreliable and that his version of reality was more accurate. Breaking free from that kind of control is like recovering from a form of psychological captivity." The comparison to captivity felt accurate. For months, I had been living in a prison of doubt and self-criticism that Derek and Chloe had constructed around me. The walls of that prison had been built from my own vulnerabilities and insecurities, making them almost invisible until I had gained enough distance to see their true nature. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, my phone rang with a call from Dr. Her voice was tense but excited as she delivered news that would change everything about our investigation. "Miss Vance, I need you to come in tomorrow morning. We've discovered something in Miss Brennan's office that you need to see immediately, and I think you should bring Marcus Chen with you. This situation is much more serious than any of us realized." The call ended before I could ask for details, but Dr. Reeves's tone suggested that whatever they had found would provide the final pieces of evidence we needed to expose Derek and Chloe's criminal partnership. As we walked to our cars, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread about what tomorrow would bring. "Whatever they found, it's going to be the break we've been waiting for," Marcus said confidently. "Derek and Chloe have been operating under the assumption that their victims would never fight back effectively. They've gotten careless." I thought about Anna Kowalski and the other women who had been destroyed by Derek and Chloe's systematic predation. Tomorrow, we would begin the process of ensuring that their methods were exposed, and their ability to harm future victims was eliminated. It wouldn't bring Anna back or undo the damage they had caused, but it would prevent them from continuing their devastating work. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Not just about getting justice for what had been done to me, but about reclaiming the person I had been before Derek convinced me she was fundamentally flawed. The strong, independent woman who had built a successful business and trusted her own judgment hadn't been destroyed by Derek's manipulation. She had just been buried under layers of doubt and self-criticism that were finally being stripped away. As I drove back to Zoe's apartment, I realized that the most important victory in this entire process wouldn't be seeing Derek and Chloe face consequences for their actions. It would be proving to myself that I was capable of fighting back effectively and reclaiming control over my own narrative. Everything else was just details. Dr. Reeves was waiting in the lobby when Marcus and I arrived at Pacific Northwest Family Services the next morning. Her usual composed demeanor had been replaced by barely contained urgency, and she ushered us immediately toward the elevator without her typical professional pleasantries. "What we discovered yesterday evening changes the entire scope of this investigation," she said as we rode to the third floor. "I need you to understand that what you're about to see represents the most serious breach of professional ethics I've encountered in 30 years of practice." We exited the elevator and walked down a corridor lined with administrative offices. Dr. Reeves stopped at a door marked storage and unlocked it with a key she produced from her jacket pocket. Inside, the room had been transformed into what appeared to be a makeshift evidence archive, with boxes of files, computer equipment, and recording devices arranged on several tables. Yesterday, our IT department was conducting routine maintenance on the building's security system when they discovered that Ms. Brennan had been using unauthorized recording equipment in her office. Dr. Reeves explained she had been secretly recording therapy sessions for the past 18 months, maintaining detailed audio and video records of client interactions without consent or documentation. Marcus whistled low. "That's a federal crime. Recording therapy sessions without consent violates multiple privacy laws." "It gets worse," Dr. Reeves continued, leading us to a table covered with transcripts. "The recordings weren't just being stored. They were being analyzed and categorized in ways that suggest systematic exploitation of client vulnerabilities." She handed me a manila folder containing what appeared to be detailed psychological profiles. The first page was labeled, "Subject, Natalie Vance," and contained information that made my stomach turn. Every vulnerability I had shared in therapy, every fear and insecurity, had been documented with clinical precision alongside notes about how each piece of information could be leveraged for maximum psychological impact. "This isn't therapy documentation," I said, reading through notes that described my childhood abandonment issues as primary manipulation vector, and my concerns about Derek's controlling behavior as resistance patterns requiring systematic breakdown. "Exactly. Ms. Brennan was conducting what appears to be psychological warfare rather than therapeutic intervention." Dr. Reeves showed us additional folders. She maintained similar profiles for every female client she worked with, documenting their vulnerabilities and tracking the effectiveness of various manipulation techniques. Marcus picked up another folder labeled "Corporate Targets" and began. His expression darkened as he scanned the contents. "These are the women Derek identified through his consulting work. Chloe has detailed psychological profiles for each of them, including strategies for exploiting their professional insecurities and personal relationships." The scope of their operation was staggering. They hadn't just been targeting individual women, they had been conducting what amounted to psychological experiments, testing different manipulation techniques, and documenting which methods were most effective for destroying their victims' confidence and independence. "Reeves, how many women are we talking about total?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Based on the files we've recovered so far, at least 37 women over the past 3 years. Some were Derek's intimate partners, others were targets of his corporate consulting work, and several were women who sought individual therapy from Chloe for relationship or workplace issues." She paused, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was revealing. "Brennan kept detailed records of their psychological destruction, including follow-up documentation of the long-term impacts on their mental health, careers, and relationships." I thought about Anna Kowalski and wondered if her file was among those we were looking at. The idea that her psychological torture and eventual suicide had been documented and analyzed as part of Chloe's research was almost too horrific to process. "There's something else," Dr. Reeves said, leading us to a computer terminal. The recordings and profiles were being uploaded to a secure server that Derek maintained for his consulting business. They were sharing detailed psychological data about their victims, using it to refine their manipulation techniques and identify new targets. Marcus sat down at the computer and began examining the digital evidence. "This is sophisticated psychological warfare. They were treating these women like test subjects in some kind of twisted behavioral experiment." As I watched Marcus navigate through the digital files, I began to understand that what I had experienced wasn't just personal betrayal or professional misconduct. It was part of a systematic program of psychological abuse that had been refined and perfected over years of practice. Derek and Chloe had turned the destruction of women into a science. Dr. Reeves, what's the legal status of this evidence? Can it be used in criminal proceedings? The unauthorized recordings present some legal complications because they were obtained without the subject's consent, she replied. However, the psychological profiles and the evidence of systematic manipulation can definitely be used to support criminal charges. I've already contacted the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and the State Attorney General's office. Federal involvement meant that Derek and Chloe would face resources and expertise that could match the sophistication of their operation. But it also meant that the investigation would take time, and I worried about what they might do if they realized their activities had been discovered. Do Derek and Chloe know about this discovery yet? I asked. Ms. Brennan was terminated yesterday afternoon and escorted from the building by security, Dr. Reeves said. She demanded to know why she was being fired, but we didn't provide specifics. However, she's certainly aware that her employment has been terminated, and she may suspect that we've discovered her recording activities. Marcus looked up from the computer. If they know they're under investigation, they're going to try to destroy evidence or flee. We need to move quickly to secure everything they might try to eliminate. The FBI is obtaining search warrants for Derek's office and their shared residence, Dr. Reeves said. But there's something else you need to know. Based on the financial records we've found, Derek and Chloe have been funneling money into offshore accounts. They may have been preparing for the possibility that their activities would eventually be discovered. The revelation that they had been planning for exposure suggested a level of criminal sophistication that went beyond opportunistic manipulation. They had been operating a deliberate fraud scheme with contingency plans for avoiding consequences. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Marcus pulled up a financial spreadsheet on the computer. Based on what I can see here, over $800,000 in the past 3 years. They've been very successful at monetizing psychological destruction. The amount was staggering, representing not just the fees they had charged for their services, but also the financial damage they had inflicted on their victims. Women who had lost careers, businesses, and financial security as a result of Derek and Chloe's manipulation had unknowingly funded their own destruction. There's something else, Dr. Reeves said, handing me a thick folder. We found correspondence between Ms. Brennan and several other therapists in different states. It appears she was trying to establish a network of professionals who would use similar techniques to target vulnerable women. The folder contained emails discussing innovative therapeutic approaches for managing difficult female clients and strategies for helping male partners cope with emotionally unstable wives. The language was coded but unmistakably described the same manipulation techniques that had been used against me. They were trying to franchise their operation, Marcus said grimly. Turn psychological abuse into a business model that could be replicated across the country. The implications were terrifying. If Derek and Chloe had succeeded in training other professionals to use their methods, the number of victims could have grown exponentially. Women across the country could have been subjected to the same systematic destruction I had experienced, all under the guise of professional therapeutic intervention. Dr. Reeves, how do we stop this from spreading? How do we make sure the other therapists Chloe was corresponding with don't continue using these techniques? The state licensing boards in the affected states are being notified, and the FBI will be investigating the interstate aspects of the operation, she replied. But the most important thing is ensuring that all the victims receive proper support, and that the evidence is preserved for criminal prosecution. We spent the next several hours reviewing the evidence and coordinating with the various law enforcement agencies that would be involved in the investigation. The complexity of the case was overwhelming, but so was the strength of the evidence against Derek and Chloe. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Reeves pulled me aside. Ms. Vance, I want you to know that what you've done by coming forward has potentially saved dozens of women from experiencing what you went through. The courage it took to fight back against people who had convinced you that you couldn't trust your own perceptions was extraordinary. Her words carried a weight that I hadn't expected. In fighting for my own justice, I had apparently stumbled onto something much larger than personal vindication. The evidence we had uncovered would prevent Derek and Chloe from continuing their predatory partnership and might save other women from the kind of systematic destruction I had barely survived. What happens now? The FBI will be contacting you within the next few days to schedule formal interviews. They'll want detailed testimony about your experiences and access to any additional evidence you might have. Dr. Reeves paused. I also want to arrange for you to speak with a trauma specialist who works with abuse survivors. What you've been through was severe psychological trauma, and healing from it will require professional support. The suggestion of therapy was initially unsettling, given how therapeutic intervention had been weaponized against me, but I recognized the wisdom in seeking help from a professional who specialized in abuse recovery rather than trying to process everything on my own. Marcus and I left the building with copies of the evidence that directly related to my case and contact information for the federal agents who would be handling the investigation. As we walked to our cars, I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension about what the next phase would bring. How are you feeling about all of this? Marcus asked, as we reached the parking garage. Overwhelmed, I admitted. Part of me is relieved that there's finally proof of what Derek and Chloe were doing, but another part of me is terrified about what comes next. Federal investigation, criminal trials, having to testify about the most humiliating experiences of my life. I understand, but remember that you're not just a victim in this case, you're the catalyst that exposed an entire criminal operation. Without your willingness to fight back, Derek and Chloe would still be destroying women's lives. As I drove home, I thought about the other women whose files I had seen in that storage room. Each folder represented someone who had trusted professional expertise and been systematically betrayed. Some had lost careers, others had lost relationships, and at least one had lost her life. The weight of that responsibility felt enormous, but so did the opportunity to ensure that justice was finally served. That evening, Zoe and I met with two of the women Derek had targeted through his corporate consulting work. Sarah Chen was a former tech executive who had been forced out of her position after Derek's psychological assessment labeled her as unsuitable for leadership responsibility. Maria Santos was a marketing director who had been demoted after Derek determined she had emotional regulation issues that compromised her professional judgment. Both women had sought individual therapy with Chloe to address what they believed were legitimate psychological problems that were affecting their careers. Instead, they had been subjected to months of manipulation, designed to convince them that their professional struggles were the result of personal psychological deficiencies, rather than deliberate sabotage. I spent 2 years believing I was fundamentally unsuited for executive leadership, Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Chloe convinced me that my advocacy for diversity initiatives was actually a manifestation of my own insecurity and need for validation. She helped me understand that my male colleagues weren't dismissing my ideas because of bias, but because I was presenting them in emotionally charged ways that made people uncomfortable. Maria's story was similar. Derek's assessment said I had difficulty accepting constructive feedback and tended to personalize professional criticism. Chloe spent months helping me understand how my emotional responses were creating problems for my team and damaging my professional reputation. Both women had been convinced that their professional difficulties were the result of psychological problems that required therapeutic intervention. They had paid Chloe substantial fees for individual therapy designed to help them become more effective in their careers, not realizing that the very person providing treatment was part of the system that had damaged their professional standing. The worst part, Sarah continued, is that I started to believe them. I convinced myself that my concerns about workplace discrimination were just manifestations of my own psychological issues. I apologized to male colleagues who had undermined me, thinking I was taking responsibility for my own emotional problems. I recognized the pattern immediately. Derek and Chloe had used the same technique on all of us, convincing us that our legitimate concerns about mistreatment were actually symptoms of psychological dysfunction that required professional intervention. How did you finally realize what had really happened? I asked. When I saw the announcement about Derek and Chloe's relationship at your anniversary party, Maria replied. I suddenly understood that the therapist who had been treating me for workplace emotional issues was romantically involved with the consultant who had identified those issues in the first place. The whole thing had been orchestrated. The three of us spent the evening comparing our experiences and identifying the common manipulation techniques that had been used against us. The consistency was remarkable. Derek and Chloe had developed a systematic approach to psychological destruction that they applied with minor variations to each of their victims. "We need to make sure this gets public attention," Sarah said. "Not just criminal prosecution, but media coverage that warns other women about these techniques. Derek and Chloe may be stopped, but there could be other predators using similar methods." I agreed, but I also knew that going public would mean exposing the most humiliating aspects of our victimization to widespread scrutiny. "Are you prepared for that level of attention, for having your personal struggles become public knowledge?" "I'm prepared for whatever it takes to prevent other women from going through what we did," Maria replied. "The shame belongs to Derek and Chloe, not to us." As we planned our coordinated response to the investigation and potential media attention, I realized that the woman sitting at that table was fundamentally different from the one who had discovered her husband's betrayal just 5 days earlier. I had gone from being a victim who questioned her own perceptions to being an advocate who was helping other victims understand and articulate their experiences. The transformation wasn't complete, and I knew that healing from systematic psychological abuse would take time and professional support. But I also knew that I had survived the worst of it and emerged with my core strength intact. Derek and Chloe had tried to convince me that I was fundamentally flawed, but their failure to completely destroy me had ultimately led to their own exposure. The next morning brought a call from FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who scheduled a formal interview for the following week. Her voice was professional but warm, and she assured me that the Bureau had extensive experience with cases involving psychological manipulation and fraud. "Vance, I want you to know that we take this type of case very seriously," Agent Walsh said. "The systematic nature of the abuse you and the other victims experienced, combined with the financial exploitation and potential interstate crimes, makes this a high-priority investigation." As I prepared for the federal interview, I realized that the most important phase of this entire process was about to begin. The evidence gathering was complete, the victims had been identified, and now it was time to ensure that Derek and Chloe faced appropriate consequences for their crime. But more than that, it was time to reclaim my own story and help other women understand that the psychological manipulation we had experienced wasn't a reflection of our weakness or inadequacy. It was a reflection of the predatory skill of two people who had turned the destruction of women into a profitable criminal enterprise. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt genuinely excited about the future, not just about seeing justice served, but about the possibility of using my experience to help other women recognize and resist similar manipulation. The strength that Derek and Chloe had tried so hard to destroy was still intact, and now I was ready to use it. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland felt imposing as I climbed the stone steps 3 weeks after my initial FBI interview. Agent Walsh had called the night before to inform me that Derek and Chloe had been arrested simultaneously in coordinated raids on their home and offices. The evidence seized during those raids had been even more damning than what we had already uncovered. Inside the courthouse, I met with Assistant U.S. Attorney David Kim, who would be prosecuting the case. He was younger than I had expected, but his briefing materials suggested he specialized in complex fraud cases involving professional misconduct. His confidence was reassuring as he outlined the charges that had been filed against Derek and Chloe. "We're pursuing federal charges of wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud," Attorney Kim explained. The interstate nature of their operation, combined with the systematic targeting of victims and the sophisticated money laundering scheme, makes this a federal case with serious consequences. Derek and Chloe were each facing up to 20 years in federal prison if convicted on all charges. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including the unauthorized recordings, the detailed victim profiles, the financial records showing systematic exploitation, and testimony from 37 identified victims across 6 states. What about the other therapists Chloe was corresponding with? I asked. Are they facing charges as well? We're investigating each case individually. Some of the therapists appear to have been unwitting participants who were manipulated by Miss Brennan into adopting questionable technique. Others were more actively involved and will likely face their own charges. Attorney Kim paused. Your case, Vance, is particularly important because you have documentation of the entire cycle of their operation, from the initial targeting through the financial exploitation to the ultimate discard. The courthouse was buzzing with activity as Derek and Chloe's arraignment proceeded. I had chosen not to attend, but Marcus had gone to observe and report back. When he called me afterward, his voice carried a satisfaction I hadn't heard before. They both pled not guilty, but their lawyers looked like they wanted to be anywhere else, Marcus reported. The judge set bail at $500,000 each, and they had to surrender their passports. Derek's parents were in the courtroom, and they wouldn't even look at him. The sight of Derek's family rejecting him provided a kind of poetic justice, considering how he had manipulated family relationships throughout his predatory career. The man who had convinced multiple families that the women they loved were psychologically unstable was now facing the consequences of his own actions without family support. Over the following weeks, the case attracted significant media attention. The story of a domestic violence counselor and her accomplice systematically targeting vulnerable women resonated with journalists and the public alike. Reeves had worked with our legal team to ensure that the media coverage focused on the systematic nature of the abuse, rather than sensationalizing individual victim stories. The attention brought forward additional victims who had been manipulated by Derek and Chloe, but hadn't initially realized the systematic nature of what they had experienced. A hotline set up by Pacific Northwest Family Services received over 200 calls from women who believed they might have been targeted by similar schemes. Sarah Chen had taken a leading role in organizing the victim advocacy efforts, using her executive experience to coordinate media appearances and support services. We're not just seeking justice for what happened to us, she told a local television reporter. We're working to educate other women about these manipulation techniques, so they can recognize and resist them. The media coverage also prompted legislative action. State representatives in Oregon and Washington introduced bills requiring stricter oversight of therapeutic relationships and mandatory reporting requirements for suspected professional misconduct. The proposed legislation was being called the Brennan Protocol in recognition of the systematic nature of the abuse that had been uncovered. 2 months after their arrest, Derek's consulting business clients began filing civil lawsuits, alleging fraud and seeking damages for the professional harm caused by his deliberately biased assessment. The tech startup that had demoted Sarah Chen based on Derek's evaluation was facing a multi-million-dollar discrimination lawsuit that cited his psychological manipulation as evidence of systematic bias against female employees. The civil cases could end up being more significant than the criminal charges, Attorney Kim explained during one of our preparation meetings. Derek and Chloe's criminal behavior created liability for every organization that relied on their professional services, without proper oversight. The financial consequences for Derek and Chloe were mounting daily. Their assets had been frozen pending the criminal trial, and the civil lawsuits were seeking damages that far exceeded their ability to pay. The offshore accounts Marcus had discovered were being recovered through international cooperation agreements, ensuring that their victims would eventually receive some compensation for the harm they had suffered. 3 months after the arrests, I received an unexpected call from Anna Kowalski's sister Rebecca. She had seen the media coverage and wanted to thank me for exposing the people responsible for Anna's death. Anna tried to tell people what Derek and Chloe were doing to her, Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. But they had convinced everyone, including our family, that she was having a psychological breakdown. Your courage in fighting back gave Anna the justice she never received while she was alive. The conversation with Rebecca was both heartbreaking and healing. Learning that Anna had tried to resist Derek and Chloe's manipulation, that she had recognized what was happening to her, somehow made her death feel less like defeat and more like the tragic end of a fight she had been trying to win. Rebecca, I need you to know that Anna's case was what motivated Marcus to help me, I said. Her death wasn't meaningless. It led to exposing Derek and Chloe's entire operation, and potentially saving dozens of other women. The criminal trial began 6 months after the arrest. I had been preparing for weeks with attorney Kim and the victim advocates, practicing my testimony and reviewing the evidence that would be presented. The courtroom was packed with victims, their supporters and media representatives covering what had become a nationally significant case. Derek and Chloe's defense strategy became clear during opening statements. They claimed that their relationship had developed naturally during professional interactions, and that any harm to their clients was unintentional. Their lawyers portrayed them as dedicated professionals who had made personal mistakes but hadn't committed crimes. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Attorney Kim presented the evidence chronologically, showing how Derek and Chloe had refined their manipulation techniques over years of practice. The unauthorized recordings were particularly damaging, revealing the calculating nature of their psychological manipulation. When Chloe's recorded voice discussed breaking down Natalie's resistance to Derek's financial control and exploiting her abandonment issues to increase dependency, the courtroom was silent. The clinical detachment in her voice as she described my psychological destruction was more chilling than any angry outburst could have been. My testimony lasted 2 days. Attorney Kim had prepared me well, and I was able to describe my experiences clearly and factually without becoming overwhelmed by emotion. The defense attorneys tried to portray me as a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge, but the evidence spoke for itself. Ms. Vance, the defense attorney, asked during cross-examination, "Isn't it true that you initiated this investigation because you were angry about your husband's affair?" "No," I replied calmly. "I initiated this investigation because I discovered that my husband and his therapist had been systematically manipulating me as part of a criminal fraud scheme that had victimized dozens of other women." The defense attorney pressed further, "But you've admitted that you had trust issues and anxiety problems that affected your marriage. Isn't it possible that your perceptions of Dr. Brennan's treatment were colored by your own psychological difficulties?" Attorney Kim's objection was sustained, but I had already formulated my response. The unauthorized recordings that Dr. Brennan made of our sessions provide objective evidence of what occurred. They show that she was documenting my vulnerabilities for the purpose of exploitation, not treatment. The trial continued for 3 weeks, with testimony from victim after victim describing similar patterns of manipulation and exploitation. The cumulative effect was overwhelming, creating a picture of systematic psychological warfare that couldn't be dismissed as misunderstanding or professional error. The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Patricia Hartwell, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated multiple victims. She explained how Derek and Chloe's techniques constituted sophisticated psychological torture designed to destroy their victims' sense of reality and self-worth. "What these defendants did represents a profound perversion of therapeutic principles," Dr. Hartwell testified. "They used professional credentials and therapeutic authority to systematically destroy the mental health of vulnerable women for personal and financial gain." The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both Derek and Chloe. The courtroom erupted in applause from the victims and their supporters, while Derek and Chloe showed no visible emotion as they were led away in handcuffs. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Attorney Kim was confident that both defendants would receive substantial prison terms, given the systematic nature of their crimes and the number of victims involved. The weeks between conviction and sentencing felt surreal. The media attention continued, but now it focused on the broader implications of the case for professional ethics and victim protection. I had become an inadvertent spokesperson for psychological abuse survivors, speaking at conferences and working with legislators on reform initiatives. The sentencing hearing was held on a rainy Thursday morning in November, almost exactly 1 year after the anniversary party that had started this entire journey. Derek was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, while Chloe received 15 years. Both would be required to pay full restitution to their victims and would be prohibited from working in any capacity involving psychological evaluation or treatment. As I watched them being led away for the final time, I felt a complex mixture of emotion. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the harm they had caused or bring back Anna Kowalski. What it could do was ensure that they would never again have the opportunity to systematically destroy women's lives. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters asking for my reaction to the sentences. The questions felt routine after months of media attention, but my response carried a weight that surprised me. "This case was never about revenge," I said, looking directly into the camera. "It was about ensuring that predators who use professional credentials to manipulate vulnerable people face appropriate consequences for their actions." Derek Vance and Chloe Brennan turned the destruction of women into a business model, and today they learned that such behavior carries a price. A reporter asked about my plans for the future, and I realized that for the first time in years, I actually had exciting plans to discuss. "I'm launching a nonprofit organization focused on educating women about psychological manipulation techniques and providing support for survivors of professional abuse. We're calling it the Anna Kowalski Foundation, and our goal is to ensure that no woman has to face this kind of systematic manipulation alone." The foundation had been in development for months, with funding from the civil settlements and support from Dr. Reeves and other professionals who had been horrified by Derek and Chloe's crimes. Sarah Chen had agreed to serve as executive director, while Marcus would handle security and technology issues. As the media attention died down and the crowd dispersed, I found myself standing alone on the courthouse steps, looking out at the city where my life had been destroyed and rebuilt over the course of a single year. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal at an anniversary party seemed like a stranger now, someone who had existed in a different lifetime. The rain had stopped, and weak November sunshine was breaking through the clouds. I pulled out my phone and called Zoe, who had been my constant support throughout this entire ordeal. "It's over," I said when she answered. "They're going to prison, and I'm free to move forward with my life." "How does it feel?" she asked. I considered the question, thinking about everything I had lost and everything I had gained through this process. "It feels like I finally have my life back, not the life I had before Derek, but something better, something that's completely mine." That evening, Marcus, Zoe and I had dinner at the same restaurant where we had planned our investigation 6 months earlier. The conversation was lighter than it had been in months, focusing on future plans rather than past trauma. "What's next for you, Natalie?" Marcus asked, as we finished our meal. "The foundation work will keep me busy, but I'm also thinking about writing a book about this experience," I replied. "Not just my story, but a comprehensive guide to recognizing and resisting psychological manipulation, something that could help other women avoid what we went through." Marcus nodded approvingly. "That would be valuable. Derek and Chloe may be in prison, but there are undoubtedly other predators using similar techniques." As we prepared to leave, I realized that the three of us had become more than allies in a legal battle. We had become genuine friends, bound together by shared experience and mutual respect. The relationships I had built through this crisis were deeper and more authentic than many of the friendships I had maintained during my marriage to Derek. Driving home that night, I reflected on the transformation I had undergone over the past year. The woman who had questioned her own perceptions and accepted responsibility for problems she hadn't created was gone, replaced by someone who trusted her own judgment and understood her own worth. Derek and Chloe had tried to convince me that I was fundamentally flawed, that my concerns about their behavior were manifestations of my own psychological problem. Instead, my willingness to trust my own perceptions and fight back against their manipulation had exposed a criminal enterprise and potentially saved dozens of other women from similar abuse. The Anna Kowalski Foundation officially launched 3 months later, with a mission statement that reflected everything I had learned about psychological manipulation and recovery. We provided education about manipulation techniques, support services for survivors, and advocacy for stronger professional oversight standards. Our first major initiative was developing a training program for therapists and other professionals who work with abuse survivors. The program emphasized the importance of believing victims, recognizing manipulation patterns, and avoiding the kind of victim blaming that had enabled Derek and Chloe's crime. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a letter from a woman in Seattle who had recognized her own experience in our foundation's educational material. She had been seeing a therapist who consistently dismissed her concerns about her husband's controlling behavior while validating his complaints about her emotional instability. "Reading your story helped me understand that I wasn't crazy," she wrote. "My perceptions were accurate, and my therapist was part of the problem rather than part of the solution. I've left both my husband and that therapist, and I'm rebuilding my life with proper support." Letters like hers arrived regularly, confirming that our work was making a difference. Each story of recognition and recovery validated the difficult decision I had made to fight back against Derek and Chloe rather than accepting their version of reality. On the first anniversary of Derek and Chloe's sentencing, I stood in my new office at the Anna Kowalski Foundation, looking out at the Portland skyline that had witnessed my destruction and rebirth. The view was different from this office, higher and clearer than any perspective I had enjoyed during my marriage. The woman reflected in the office window was confident, purposeful, and completely authentic. She bore little resemblance to the insecure, second-guessing person Derek had tried to create through months of systematic manipulation. The strength that had always existed within me had finally been freed from the prison of doubt and self-criticism that Derek and Chloe had constructed. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen, who was attending a conference on professional ethics in Chicago. "Just finished my presentation on recognizing manipulation in therapeutic relationships. Standing ovation from 2,000 mental health professionals. We're changing the conversation, Natalie." I smiled, thinking about how far we had all come from that devastating anniversary party 2 years ago. Derek and Chloe had tried to destroy us, but instead they had created a network of strong, knowledgeable women who were now protecting others from similar predators. The Foundation's work was expanding beyond what I had initially imagined. We were consulting with law enforcement agencies on cases involving professional manipulation, training corporate HR departments to recognize psychological abuse in workplace consulting, and working with legislative bodies to strengthen oversight of therapeutic relations. Most importantly, we were changing the narrative around psychological manipulation and abuse. Instead of focusing on victim pathology, or wondering why women allowed themselves to be manipulated, we were educating people about the sophisticated techniques predators use, and the courage it takes for survivors to fight back. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I reflected on the question that had haunted me throughout the trial and recovery process: what would Anna Kowalski think of what we had accomplished? I believed she would be proud that her death had led to exposing Derek and Chloe's criminal enterprise, and that her memory was helping other women recognize and resist similar manipulation. The Foundation's work was her legacy as much as mine, ensuring that her struggle against Derek and Chloe's psychological torture had ultimately led to their downfall and the protection of future victims. In fighting back against my own destruction, I had found a way to honor her memory and prevent other women from suffering the same fate. Walking out into the Portland evening, I felt a deep sense of completion and purpose. The nightmare that had begun with a shattered champagne glass and a public betrayal had transformed into a mission that gave meaning to everything I had endured. Derek and Chloe had tried to convince me that I was fundamentally broken, but they had instead created someone who was unbreakably strong and determined to use that strength in service of other women. The future stretched ahead of me, filled with possibilities that Derek had tried to convince me I didn't deserve, but I knew better now. I deserved everything I was brave enough to reach for, and I was braver than I had ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.